welcome back to your lessons. In this phase of vocal feminization, we will begin fully developing the triad that forms oral resonance. In the previous lesson, you learned how to raise your larynx and phonate within the female vocal range. The larynx is one of the three pillars of oral resonance. The other two are pharynx shape and tongue position. To summarize, in the first lesson, you learned to manage two simultaneous elements, raising the larynx and pitching to C4, while forming words into monotone speech. During step 2, you will now be managing 4 elements at once, while forming words into monotone speech. Like before, the skill is developed through practice and repetition, until muscle memory is established and you can perform this juggling naturally without conscious effort. All right, let's jump into it. We're going to accomplish 2 things at once, and we'll do it using another set of vocal cues. These cues will form the second half of your vocal primer. Think of the vocal primer as a single action that helps return your voice to the correct starting configuration. In other words, the vocal primer, the group of vocal cues you are learning, functions as training wheels for the first portion of these lessons, helping guide your voice into the proper position each time you begin speaking. Now, I should warn you, this part may feel a little bit silly. Bear with me for a moment. To bring the tongue forward into an ideal position and to reduce the size of the oral resonance chamber to our desired configuration, we need a phoneme that strongly manipulates the tongue, pushing it both forward and upward. This tongue position occupies more space within the oral cavity and encourages the body to move the perceived location of phonation, where speech seems to originate, forward, away from the throat and towards the mouth. The phoneme we are going to be using is nya. Is it silly? Yes. Is it necessary? Also yes. Not because we're trying to turn anyone into a trans cat lady, but because forming the phoneme nya requires you to press your tongue forward against the teeth while simultaneously lifting the back of the tongue upward. This creates exactly the tongue position we want for this exercise. It just so happens to sound like a cat noise. That is purely coincidental. So we now have our phoneme, nya. How does this accomplish 2 birds with 1 stone, you might be asking? The phoneme itself already accomplishes the first task. Simply forming the sound nya naturally places the tongue in the position we want. That alone handles the tongue positioning portion of that exercise. The second part comes from how we say the phoneme, and more importantly, what we are listening to when we say it. While forming nya, we are also going to narrow the pharynx, the muscles of the throat. By gently constricting the pharynx, we create a narrower pathway for the air traveling from the lungs, past the raised larynx, and upward towards the mouth. You can think of this in a similar way to how wind instruments behave. As the tube of a wind instrument becomes narrower, the sound produced becomes brighter, lighter, and more delicate. Your voice behaves exactly the same way because in many respects, it functions like a wind instrument itself. Now, the sound we are aiming for here is not meant to be pretty. It does not need to sound natural or feminine yet. At this stage, we are not trying to create a passing voice. That comes later. Instead, we are creating an audible cue, a sound that tells us the pharynx is properly narrowed. The quality we are listening for is slightly buzzy and shrill, almost like the faint buzzing of a mosquito near your ear. When you phonate nya, you will gently constrict the throat along with it so that the resulting sound has this slightly irritating quality to it. That irritating quality is the audible cue. When you hear that slight buzzing at the end of the phoneme, it tells you that your larynx is narrowed correctly. I'll demonstrate the sound for you now. Listen carefully, because you will need to replicate this. Nya, nya, nya. Listen carefully to the end of each sound. It should not sound smooth or pleasant. It should have a slightly buzzy, almost irritating quality to it. Please take this part seriously. I know it may feel a little silly. Trust me, this is about as goofy as the lessons are going to get. Except that panting exercise. But the exercise itself is very important, and it needs to be performed accurately. You're creating an audible cue for yourself, so it must be precise, and it must be consistent. What you should be internalizing when you hear this sound is, when I hear the buzzing after nya, my pharynx is narrowing correctly, my tongue is positioned forward and upward, and my phonation is being pushed forward toward the mouth. That is the association we are building. Let's listen to it one more time. Nya, nya, nya. Continue practicing the nya phoneme until you are able to reproduce the annoying, buzzy quality we discussed. If you plan to submit voice clips for feedback, this would be a good time to do so. All right. Once you've grasped how to narrow the pharynx and consistently produce the buzzing quality, we can move on to the next phase. In this section, we'll be adding the new buzzy nya phoneme to your existing vocal primer. At this stage, I recommend making the sound more compact and shortening the time spent on each phonation. This helps conserve air that you'll need for reading longer passages. The combined vocal primer sounds like this. Nya, nya, nya. This is the complete vocal primer, and it performs 4 functions. It audibly cues the position of your larynx, raised. It pitches your voice to C4. It brings the tongue forward, and it audibly cues the narrowing of the pharynx. Think of this primer as your tuning fork, or your training wheels, for your voice during the early stages of this process. Whenever you feel lost, if your larynx drops accidentally, or if something simply feels off, return to the vocal primer to reset your position. The final stage of step 2 is to use the full vocal primer and then transition directly into your previous exercise of monotone speech. In doing so, you increase the concurrent load from 2 simultaneous vocal actions to 4. When you are able to read the following passage clearly, consistently, and without losing your breath, you're ready to move on to step 3. Nya, nya, nya. Transformation is not gentle in the way we imagine. It asks for patience. It asks for repetition. It asks us to listen closely to ourselves, not to judge, but to understand. At first, the sound may feel unfamiliar in the mouth. The resonance may shift like light through moving water. The breath may need to be steadied. The muscles may need to relearn what they have always done. Practice makes perfect. I'll see you in the next video when this no longer feels like a challenge. This one was a little bit shorter than the other. The next one won't be. See you later, girlies.
I began to understand this path was always mine. I chose to follow it, even when it was difficult. was right.